public programming, our publications, podcasts, and thought-provoking journals.
Having the Bush Center here is really the crown jewel of the campus. Everyone associated with SMU is extremely proud of it.
We are honored to be on this great campus and be able to partner with the SMU community and its world-class faculty. And we've always enjoyed sharing our programs with SMU students and the broader community.
In addition, principled leadership never goes out of style. President and Mrs. Bush have set the example, and we want to follow it.
My hope is that the Bush Center will always serve as a place where timeless principles are celebrated, protected, and promoted. We've had a great start. Now we must make sure our mission endures for generations to come.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you all. Be seated. Thank you for coming. Welcome to an Engage event sponsored by Next Point. And on behalf of Ken Hirsch, President and CEO of the Bush Center and his team, we welcome you and thank you for coming. I know today's participants quite well. I've known Betsy DeVos a long time. She's a political activist out of Michigan, a reasonable soul who became Secretary of Education under President Trump. Deb Birx was the AIDS coordinator, basically ran PEPFAR for 19 years and did a really good job. She's well known for being the COVID response coordinator. I'm not sure it's a title she actually clings to. Let's just say the COVID coordinator. But these are very smart, capable women, and we're honored to have them on our stage here, and I think you're going to find their discussion to be really interesting. And leading the discussion is Holly Kuzmich, the Executive Director, soon to be past Executive Director. We're losing Holly, but she'll be ably replaced by David Kramer. Anyway, we're in good shape here, and we want to thank you for supporting the Bush Center, and welcome to the Engage event. Please welcome Betsy DeVos, Deb Birx, and Holly Kuzmich.
Well, good evening. Great to be here. Dr. Birx, Secretary DeVos, thank you for being here as well. Let's get into an interesting conversation tonight. We have lots to talk about. Dr. Birx, President Bush mentioned several of your more recent jobs, running PEPFAR, COVID response coordinator. But I want to make sure people know a little bit more about you and your background. You're a medical doctor, obviously. You were a colonel in the U.S. Army.
In the Army. Are there other services?
How did you get interested and why did you make your life's work about pandemics and specifically about HIV/AIDS?
You know, I was very fascinated by the immune system and how it worked. And people were very interested in viruses, but I was more interested in what our body does to respond to viruses or respond to bacteria. And we were learning so much about immunology in the late 70s, early 80s. It was a very exciting time. So I decided that I would study the immunology, and I was working between NIH and Walter Reed because it was a joint fellowship, and this mystery illness appeared on our doorsteps. And when you think you're smart and you're educated and that you can do anything, and then you're humbled by not being able to do anything. So when the first young soldiers arrived dying from HIV, and we didn't know what it was so humbling, so devastating, that I said to myself, I'm going to make sure that the rest of my life is dedicated to figuring out how to stop this kind of human suffering. And I think that's why COVID was so hard for me personally, because again, people were succumbing to a virus that we didn't have any treatment for. We didn't have a vaccine, we didn't have treatment, and it was just like those early days of HIV when everybody was scared. You know, we didn't know what HIV was, we didn't know what AIDS was, we knew that people were dying, but we didn't know what was causing it, and we didn't know how to treat it.
Yep.
And so all pandemics cause fear in the population, and that leads to misinformation. And so it was predictable that there would be misinformation in COVID.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll get to that in a minute.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about HIV and AIDS in a program that we all know and love here at the Bush Center, which is PEPFAR, as President Bush mentioned, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Talk a little bit about, and we're about to hit the 20th anniversary of PEPFAR, and we'll talk a lot about what we've learned in 20 years, but talk about what was going on 20 years ago. What did it look like then, and what kind of progress have we made?
So we figured out what was causing HIV in 1985-86, got immediately a test for it, and then developed a series of medications. And by 1996, we had medications that if you lived to 1996, you're alive today, if you were an American. But I was working globally. And so I was starting field sites in Africa in 1998, in Thailand. And I was in Africa, and the same thing was happening in the early 80s. Now it's happening in Africa in the late 90s. Mothers, fathers, grandmothers, teachers, all dying. Being wheeled to the hospital and being turned away because there was nothing to treat them with. And it just is amazing to me that the whole world knew it. The whole world knew Africa was dying. The whole world knew that 20% of parents and grandparents were infected and were dying, and the entire fabric of Africa was being ripped apart. But there's only one person who did something, and that was President Bush. And I'm always fascinated that we had global leaders all across the world who had to see what I was seeing. I mean, the reports were in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the front page of the Time magazine, yet only one person acted.
Well, now she's just sucking up to the person.
It's true. I get emotional every time because when you're there and you have nothing and someone says, I'm going to do something, it is pretty
So
awesome.
let's talk about what the scene looks like today. And you're going
to show a slide, right?
Show a couple of slides, because if you know Dr. Birx, you know she loves data. And so we're going to have a few things to exemplify this. But talk a little bit about what we're seeing now.
So what PEPFAR taught us through the years is you can be doing well, but not good enough. So every time you make progress, and you can see that blue line, that is new infections. But that orange line was stubbornly high in Cameroon. And
which is deaths.
yes, that was deaths from HIV. And we did a deep dive into why is this? And it's never a simple answer. We want it to be simple, and we want the solution to be simple. But it was a combination of poverty, formal and informal fees. So if you came to the doctor to get an HIV test, although I had made the test free, that clinic was charging you to be seen. And so mothers were making a choice between food that night or test and treatment for HIV. And this was in 14 years into PEPFAR. And so we worked with the governments to get policy changed. And everybody said governments would never give up formal and informal healthcare fees. And they did. So when people say this can't be done and it won't be done, data really speaks, because when you show them this line and you say, look, we brought medication, we have everything to save their lives, and this is happening. Now, this is Eswatini. Now, they had a problem with continuing new infections. Eswatini was Swaziland. They had 50% of every single adult infected with HIV, 50%. And we could see that new infections had come down, but not enough. And so we were down to like 30% of every adult having HIV. And we completely reevaluated the program, worked with the King and the Prime Minister, He put in new policies that made it possible to get treatment to younger men and women and really use different information and use their social media to really get it to young men and women. And you can see we dramatically changed the rate of new infections. And so I keep telling people every day that it's great to have data, but the only reason you have data is to drive action. And if you're not using it to change and push and make sure the future is different for others, then you're failing.
So what is it important for us to know now about what we still need to be doing to address HIV and AIDS?
So you can see that in both of those cases, we're down to a level that we hadn't been in Africa for 30 years. So you can control a pandemic without a vaccine. But you have to have data, you have to have political will, and you have to bring solutions down to the level of the community, and you have to make sure that the community understands everything that they need in order to act, in order to do the things that they need to do to survive and thrive. And we still have gaps, and we have gaps particularly among adolescent children who are HIV infected, who have lived but were never diagnosed because there's still, excuse me, a lot of stigma. And we have gaps in the LGBT community around the globe. So there's still work to be done, but the progress is phenomenal. But the progress was possible because PEPFAR said from the beginning, we're not going to live by perception, we're going to live by data. And data drove a whole new program with a whole different approach that brought all the government together. Now the four services of the military does work effectively together when you have a joint chiefs that brings them together on a mission, and that's what PEPFAR was. We had a joint chief that brought all of the agencies together to work on a single mission.
Yeah. Okay, so let's fast forward to February of 2020. You were in Africa.
Yes.
When you got a phone call saying, we want you back here and we want you to lead the COVID response.
And the domestic COVID response.
The domestic COVID response.
I was leading the global COVID response. Yes.
So that's an interesting point, right? You were working globally, and then you were asked to come work on a pandemic in the United States, which opened up a whole new and different set of issues. But a lot of what you knew about addressing pandemics in your career, you were able to bring into that job. There's a lot, we could explore this, a lot, but talk a little bit about some of the lessons you've learned over the past 2 years from dealing with COVID that we all need to keep in mind as we go forward.
So data is great, but you have to talk to people. And so by the end of June of 2020, I was out in every state, meeting with communities, meeting with governors, meeting with mayors, meeting with local NGOs, just to really understand what people were internalizing, what were they hearing, what were they thinking about this pandemic, what did they heard they could do to prevent spread, and worked with all of the governors, who I have to say, I couldn't tell if they were Democrat or Republican when it came to COVID. Everybody was united in trying to figure this out together. And I think that's what something is lost in all of this, because sometimes people are presenting it as he did this and he did that and it was not good, and wasn't that way at all. At the state level and at the community level, people were pulling together in unique ways to really work on this. But this country and our federal agencies that work domestically were used to collecting data just to watch it rather than to act on it. And this country has to learn what we learned in PEPFAR, that data is not for you to collect and put in a scientific journal. It is to act and act that day.
So let's show your next two slides. We'll bring up, there's one on life expectancy. So just speak to this and what this shows us.
So this is just the last 2 years. And I think what's often not discussed in the media is you can see that life expectancy in tribal nations drop by 6 years. That was the largest drop across the board. Then you see loss of life expectancy among Black, brown, and white communities. And I think what this illustrated to me, when you see this, you know that there's an underlying problem. This is not something that just appears because of COVID. There is something wrong with our response, and there's something wrong about how we're delivering or how people have access to care, which is what we had to confront in Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to get treatment to everybody, you got to get treatment to everybody. And not everybody had access to what they needed to survive.
Yep. Okay, your next slide, you just mentioned, this sort of shows, this is states and is it COVID cases?
So it's COVID deaths.
Yep.
They're spread out just so you can see the name of all the states. And I wanted to show you this because you can see all the states, about 42 of them, are all within a glom in the middle, between 300 and 400 deaths per 100,000. Independent of the size of the state, independent of whether it's a Democratic governor or a Republican governor. So this tells to me there's some systemic issue. Yes, Mississippi is a little bit higher. They have some of the least access to health care, and then you can see Puerto Rico, Vermont down at the bottom with a much lower death rate. But most of the states are all together. And if you show the next slide, so I really was working to figure out what are these root causes? What is our problem that we need to address? This was published before COVID. So we knew, this is like watching the AIDS epidemic get out of control in sub-Saharan Africa and doing nothing. This is the mortality gap, and it shouldn't read Republican counties versus Democratic counties. It should read rural versus urban. And if you look at the gap, the rural counties have been in a stall of high fatalities across the board for more than a decade, and it gets worse every year. And so it's not that COVID brought out a whole new set of issues. It confirmed the issues that we had been writing about domestically for decades. And it just, Holly knows, it just makes me angry. Because when we solved this in Africa, we fixed it. And we fixed it because President Bush said, you will fix it. And he believed we could fix it. So we fixed it. And we continue to fix it. Someone's been looking at this, and this was in Scientific American, so many people had access to this. This gap has been widening over the last 10 years, and if you look by the 7 major diseases that the United States tracks, the rural counties haven't improved in any of them.
Yeah. And I think that next slide shows you the kind of rural-urban divide.
So these are the increase in mortality rates in 25 to 44-year-olds, all cause. So these are young people, young, vibrant, life ahead of them people. The red shows in the last 20 years, rather than improving, it's gotten worse. The blue shows where it's improving, which is every metro. Now you might say, well, how is this possible? I'll tell you how it's possible. All of the money, all of the research goes into metro research in large institutions that have no outreach into rural communities and no engagement with rural communities. And about half of our hospitals in the rural communities have closed over the last decade. Silently, quietly, just disappearing, no primary care. I loved it when people would get up and say, go to your primary physician and learn about how to get your vaccine. There aren't any primary physicians in these red areas. So these are our red counties. These are our tribal nation counties. You can see the 4 corners and the extraordinarily high fatality rates. So this is what we had been tracking. This was published in 2018, but no one acted. And I just think we passionately need, we know what to do. We know how to translate everything that we learned in sub-Saharan Africa to change this in the United States. It is not expensive. We don't need more money, but we need to program the money in an equitable and need-based way so that people in rural areas have the same access as people in urban areas.
Okay. We're going to come to some of the sort of innovations that have come out of COVID too, but I want to turn to Secretary DeVos and talk a little bit about education for a bit. Secretary DeVos, you've had one of your long-standing issues that you care so deeply about is what you call educational freedom. A lot of people refer to it as school choice, but talk about why you call it educational freedom and what that means.
Well, thanks, Holly. To me, education freedom means beyond school choice in that when we think of school choice, we think of buildings that exist today, and we think of structures and approaches that exist today. And I believe what we need for K-12 education experience goes way beyond what exists today. And it goes to, in fact, what some very creative and out of necessity folks have started to create during the last 2 years when the schools that their children were going to were either closed down or they realized they were not doing the job for their children. And they've started creating their own approaches. So whether it's a 21st century one-room schoolhouse or a learning pod, as some people will call it, or a micro school, those are just a couple of different examples of creative, different approaches that we really need to have interjected into a system that has operated in essentially the same way for 175 years.
You've talked about education being one of the least disrupted industries in America.
That's right.
Say more about that.
You know, we spend $750 billion a year on K-12 education, and the Department of Education, the federal department, was created in 1979 as a payoff to the teachers union when Jimmy Carter got their endorsement that year, the first time they endorsed, with the express purpose of closing the achievement gap. We've spent over $1 trillion at the federal level alone trying to close that achievement gap. And President Bush did a yeoman's job leading that discussion about the soft bigotry of low expectations that we have continued to persist with. Over $1 trillion at the federal level alone, and not only have those achievement gaps not narrowed one little bit, but even pre-pandemic, they were widening for most students and at most levels. The bottom performers were falling off, and the top performers have leveled off. It's even worse in the data we have since the pandemic.
Yeah. So, you know, in so much of the, obviously I've worked in education policy before too, and there's so much of a sort of siloed discussion in education. It's you're for public school, or you're for private school, or you're for charter schools. And it's so detrimental to the conversation. How do we break through that? How have you talked about that in your, you know, decades of work advocating for choice and options for kids and families?
Well, I like to talk about kids in their backpacks going to school every day with the things they need for the day in their backpack. We should be talking metaphorically about the resources that are being spent on that child, attaching to that child's backpack and going with him or her to the education experience that their family decides is best for them. And I say experience to broaden it from the brick and mortar buildings that we think of today. I don't think we should be as focused on the adjective that comes before the word school as much as we should be on acknowledging that every student is different and has different learning styles and needs, and yet we continue to try to force fit most of them into a system that has changed very little in the last century plus.
Where, in terms of some of these, you spoke of a couple of the innovations that came out of COVID. Where do you see sort of the movement today? Are you in a better place? Are you in a worse place?
Well, the last 2 years, families really have had a front row seat to their child's education. And in many cases, the system has let the children down. You know, Deb was the first Dr. Birx was the first medical professional in leadership that really drew attention to the fact that all of these prolonged school closures were having a hugely negative effect on the mental health and the emotional development of kids. And so the last 2+ years, the system has really failed way too many kids. It's failed way too many families. And the front row seat that parents have had have either demonstrated that the system isn't up to the task. They stayed closed for months on end. They had mandates that came and went. They had distance learning that came and went, or distance learning that was so unimpressive and non-robust that kids fell further and further behind. They had front row seat to curriculum that they were either appalled by or very unhappy with and disappointed by. And so it has really awakened families, parents, in a way that they had not been before, many of them. Now, there have been many low-income parents who've long been aware of the failings of their kids' schools to which they are assigned, but they haven't had the options to choose something different. I believe that momentum, it is true that the momentum around change and around policies at the state level, around empowering families and using that metaphorical backpack to attach the funding to children versus a building or a system is rolling like never before. Most recently, the state of Arizona has passed a statewide program that will allow every child in that state, if the school to which they're assigned is not working for them, their families can take 90% of what the state spends on that child and use it to buy their education in another location or in a customized fashion.
Talk a little bit more about that customization piece and some of the innovations that have particularly come out because of COVID, but maybe not solely come out.
Well, I mentioned a couple of them. I mean, there have been the rise in the number of families homeschooling children across every demographic has just mushroomed, and the ability to continue to foster that kind of learning environment where perhaps 4 or 5 families with 10 or 12 students get together, and they have identified, many of them during the COVID, the pandemic, identified a really great teacher who was sort of on the sidelines because their school was shut down or whatever. They were very unhappy with however their school was handling it. And they've hired that teacher to essentially foster a one-room schoolhouse and using a lot of new technology to be able to introduce distance learning in a way that's actually effective and works. Just one small example of the ways that families have started taking matters into their own hands and are really demanding the opportunity to continue those kinds of efforts on behalf of their kids. I visited with Governor Ducey in Arizona, and this Arizona program is really going to help facilitate this. Many families from the urban areas had done just that, and because of the unique nature of the charter laws in Arizona, they were able to get funds to facilitate some of these one-room schoolhouse or learning pod type approaches through a charter school that was already in existence there. But there are countless examples of creative approaches to different types of learning, but they haven't been able to really grow or multiply in any way because it's limited to families that can afford to do something different. I think about a small school in West Michigan where my husband Dick and I live, and I haven't visited this school yet, but most of you anybody who knows about Michigan, it's cold in the winter, lots of snow. This particular little school is an outdoor school, outdoors year-round. Kids are outdoors all day, every day for their learning. And the teachers are as well. And they're choosing to be there, and they have a wait list to get into this school. Now, it's just one example of a different way of learning that really needs to have the ability, families have to have the ability to choose that way if that's what really unlocks a kid's potential.
Yeah. Okay, so let's touch on higher ed a little bit, which is also not always known for being disrupted, but there are some disruptive models out there. What are some of the promising things you see in higher ed, and what are some of the big barriers that stand in the way?
Well, there are a number of things in higher ed that, I think about University of Arizona's and Michael Crow's very innovative approach to ensuring that students are on track, finishing, that are, it is very oriented around meeting students' needs versus a very institutional, always done this way approach. I visited another interesting approach in headquartered in San Francisco, Minerva, where students are there for the first year, and then for the successive 3 years, they live in 6 other major cities in the world, all while doing all of their learning at a distance from instructors that could be anywhere else in the world. It's all a virtual environment, but they are physically located in different places with internships to go along with it. We did a lot of work in the Trump administration around access to higher ed, beyond, education beyond high school that is not necessarily four-year college, but that is really meeting the needs and the opportunities in the career environment today, whether there's shorter-term certification programs or other shorter-term approaches that will get a young person prepared for any one of the millions of jobs that are going unfilled today that do require something beyond high school, but not 4 years. And I think that traditional four-year institutions are also having to really re-examine what they are offering and whether it is really matching up with what is required today. Yeah. Because again, for many students, they paid full tuition and yet they were kept from classrooms for months on end and didn't really have the experience they were expecting. Many of them, rightfully so, are questioning the value of a four-year residential college, and those that are being most creative about recognizing that and getting in front of opportunities to help facilitate students' faster transition through their learning are the ones that are going to, I think, be really successful long-term.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk to the both of you. You were obviously both serving in the administration during COVID. And I just want to exemplify something you said, Secretary DeVos. The nation's report card results came out pretty recently. They did the assessment nationwide in 2020. They did it again in 2022, specifically to be able to see how we as a country performed in reading and math for 9-year-olds. And we had the biggest drops we've basically ever seen.
Yes.
Scores for 9-year-olds in reading went down 5 points. And the discrepancy was big. Higher performing students only dropped 2 points. The bottom 10th percentile dropped 10 points. So that gap was big. We had a 7-point drop in math.
And 14 points amongst the lowest performing students.
Right, which we have a lot of ground to make up. But I want to hear a little bit about some of the mental health issues that we knew schools and kids were dealing with too. I know this was a topic of discussion for you two as we were in those first months of COVID. And while school closure decisions weren't made at the federal level, they were made at the local and state level, you all were giving guidance. And what were you seeing at the time? And then what are you seeing today?
Well, we made several visits to schools and communities that were really figuring out a way to get kids back and to handle it in a way that was, that was comfortable for everyone involved. And I think about a visit in North Carolina to a school where, talking with one mom who, with tears in her eyes, said, "I am so thankful my daughter is back in a classroom with her peers. She was so depressed, she was suicidal, and all it took was one day back in school with her classmates, and she was totally turned around." But I'm sure there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of others for whom that situation has not rectified. And Dr. Birx can speak to the long-term ramifications here with a whole lot more data. I know anecdotally from everywhere I went and everyone I listened to, this is an issue that has major ongoing concerns. It has not been addressed in any comprehensive way. And I don't believe it will be by a system that insists on doing things from the top down, because it really is an individualized thing. And we also know that the billions and billions of dollars, $190 billion for education, most of it has gone unspent yet. Specifically to address the issues and results of COVID, most of it has really gone unspent at this point.
Yeah, I just have to thank the secretary, because we went out on the road. So we kind of divvied up because we were in crisis mode. By July, we had a growing evidence base coming out of SAMHSA and the NIH about the number of anxiety disorders, the increased suicidal ideations, threats of suicide, emergency room visits. So you could see it skyrocketing, particularly among 12 to 16-year-old girls. That was July of 2020. And again, our federal institutions, particularly the CDC, was unwilling to put that mental health threat up there in their school guidance, which I thought was absolutely critical, that parents could be alert. We need to tell parents that it's about people having access to their peers as well as access to the teachers. And that peer-peer relationship, when we were trying to figure out how to keep young women from getting HIV, there were several studies that came out that for every year that a young woman stayed in high school in sub-Saharan Africa, they decreased their risk of acquiring HIV by 20%. It didn't even have to be a great school. It just had to be where they were surrounded by their peers and they had a support structure that allowed them to navigate very difficult times in some of these communities. That's what's happening and was needed in America. Yet, what was surprising to me, and I think surprising to the secretary, is we knew how to open up the schools, because we had groups showing us, if you did this, this, and this, it works. It protects the teachers. It protects the students. They can be back in school full time. So Secretary DeVos was out in K through 12, and I went out to the higher ed, because those of you remember, North Carolina brought all their people back and then closed 3 schools. 90,000 students were dislinked from North Carolina Chapel Hill, from North Carolina State, and Eastern Carolina overnight. But 85% of them were living in apartments. So now they were in apartments in that community, dislinked completely from a structure or a healthcare or outreach. And I was determined that that wasn't going to happen to any other school. So I went to every SEC school except for University of Georgia, because they wouldn't let me come in. But other than that, I think they were afraid I was going to shut down their football team or something. And they did have a good year. So yeah, they were probably right, because I did spend a lot of time at LSU. That said, what was exciting to me is watching presidents of universities and boards of trustees coming together and saying, this is our job. It's our job to educate, and it's our job to have people in person, and it's our job to ensure that students know how to be safe and teachers know how to be safe, because we're educators.
Yeah.
And so I think hopefully when people look back, and it's part of the reason why I did write the book, is I wanted these lessons that Secretary DeVos is talking about and that I got to see. These presidents of universities opening their doors and saying, we're going to make it work. Yes, we'll do testing. Yes, we're not going to quarantine. We're only going to isolate if people are positive. They did that hard work. They showed us the roadmap. Yet schools after school, despite us saying, here's the evidence base of how to be open and how to do this, many shut their doors. And I think when that comes to higher education, I think there should be a reckoning, because people should not be presidents of universities that don't believe that their students can learn how to protect one another during a COVID pandemic. This was common sense, straightforward things that we knew worked, and I think the universities that opened and the colleges that opened, most of the HBCU opened, we got them tests so that they could keep each other safe. I mean, it was common sense to be open. And no one died in those universities or in the schools among the children that were schools that were open. So we had a roadmap for everybody to be safe. It's just, and I still don't understand why, when we knew the risk was so little for children and young adults. Because I said, switch out your students. Put a older teacher who's terrific at home watching the video and put young teachers in there. Put them, the 22-year-olds, the 21-year-olds that aren't even finished college. I mean, we took nurses out of training and put them on the front line.
Yeah.
We could have taken teachers that were in their third year and put them on the front line with backup from. So all of these things could have been done. But as the secretary said, we were mired in old thinking. And even when we had the information to show another way, I'm just glad I spent the last 20 years in Africa, because they didn't string telephone lines, they went to cell phones. So they leapfrogged right over us. They don't have banking, they have all of that phone-based banking. I mean, they have embraced technology. We need to do the same here.
Yeah.
We need to embrace technology and use it to thrive.
Dr. Birx, so what are we learning, or will we sort of find out in the coming years from a medical point of view, from going through COVID, from vaccine development, that's going to have positive implications on other issues in healthcare?
I think the innovations that came with the FDA, the emergency use authorizations, showing us that what always took 2 years could be done in 2 months. So we can get new cancer drugs.
Is that going to sort of carry forward?
We should be able to do that, because we know that we did. And that's why I don't want any of that lost. I want us to use what was really unbelievable evidence of the private sector working in deep partnership with the public sector to get things done. It was like mini Manhattan projects. The group that was working on therapeutics, the group that was working on tests, the group that was working on vaccines, they were all getting everything that they needed to be successful. But it was, it was more than money. They needed raw ingredients, but that worked. So we hold ourselves back. And I'm really hoping that the public-private partnerships that were developed and highly successful, the emergency use authorization, and we also have to realize very clearly that some institutions continue to fail us. I mean, we should all be worried right now that the same mistakes that were made in January and February of 2020 were made with monkeypox in 2022. That worries me, because it says we didn't learn our lesson. We're slow, we're late, we believe in this mystical thing that things are just gonna go away. Yeah. It's really not gonna be bad here. We see it in Europe, but somehow we think we're, I don't know, exceptional. Our bodies are the same. We have the same genetics around the world. If they're susceptible, we're susceptible. And I think the one thing for the audience, just to, because I feel like I have to do a public health moment, long COVID is serious. It is. 4 million people are on disability out of work. 15 million people have long COVID. There are a lot of things we don't know about this virus. When you lose taste and smell, they know it's because there's a cell that nourishes your neurons, that's critical for your neural pathways. Those cells got infected with COVID. And that's why you lose taste and smell, and those neurons may not grow back right. So when you're thinking about risk and risk behaviors, just understand what your risk is by age. So if you're my age and we're coming into another surge, and yes, there will be flu, because again, Australia had a normal flu season. We haven't seen one in 3 years, but we'll most likely have a normal flu season. So we need to all decide with the right information, what am I willing to take for my own personal risk during a surge? And you need that information to make that judgment. But there are ways to save COVID negative. I'm sure there's people in the audience that have gone through the last 3 years without getting COVID. And you can work, you can do all those things. You just have to decide during a surge, maybe you're not gonna take that high risk. But that's up to everybody, but it's our job to make sure people have at their fingertips every piece of information that they need in order to make their own decisions. I think decision-making is critical, but they need to be empowered with that information. Yeah. And one final thing, vaccines, great. They're not like measles, mumps, and rubella. I see some people in the audience who probably got measles, mumps, and rubella. You're probably my age. You're protected for life. You only got it once. So the vaccines were made to mimic that. And so the vaccines, you get it. You get your vaccine as a child. You don't get measles, mumps, and rubella, but you don't get it at 20 and you don't get it at 30. These vaccines, our current COVID vaccines, are not those vaccines. They don't introduce herd immunity. They don't protect you from infection for more than probably, in certain cases, 6 weeks. In some cases, if you're lucky, out to 4 months. It will protect most people from severe infection and disease. But you're not Superman if you got the vaccine. So if you're over 50 and you have comorbidities, and it's a surge and you think you have any symptoms, don't wait, test, get Paxlovid. Get Paxlovid, you'll be great. For the young people who are in the audience, make sure your parents and grandparents know this. You are the biggest force out there. You can guilt them into anything. Yeah. Tell them, get tested, get Paxlovid. If you're over 50 or you have comorbidities, get your vaccine boosters, but know that you need to layer. One thing is not going to be enough in the future.
Okay. I was just going to say the same kind of innovation that we saw in the months of the COVID pandemic and we're continuing to see, and the passion and skills of people like Dr. Birx, who we need many, many more of, all speak to what we really need to see in education, and specifically in K-12 education. You mentioned how the continent of Africa has sort of skipped past the telephone lines to the cell phone. It's interesting to note that the founder of our K-12 system, Horace Mann, died 20 years before Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Now, this is the same system that, again, most of our children experience today. We've had very little innovation. It's been a one-size-fits-all system that does not work for way too many kids. And what we need is to unleash the same kind of innovation in that experience that we see in medicine around issues like the COVID pandemic. And it can happen when families are empowered to make those decisions with those resources instead of sending the resources to systems. And I get so excited about the potential for our future when we can unlock the potential of every single child by that approach.
Secretary DeVos, I'm curious to know, you were an education advocate for many years before you became Secretary of Education. Did that experience as Secretary reaffirm what you always believed? Did it change anything about what you believed?
I would say it made it even more fervent, having worked now in a federal agency and seeing how difficult it is to get even the simplest of things done. Again, the top-down approach to millions and millions, to unlocking the potential of millions and millions and millions of individuals does not work. It cannot work. It has not worked, and it has to change. And that's why I'm very excited. The silver lining I see to COVID is the unlocking and unleashing of families across the country, grandparents across the country. I mean, we saw it in the governor's race in Virginia, where the issue around really supporting parents and kids came into clear focus. And those same discussions are happening in state after state, and that's going to be a good thing for kids.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to ask you both. You both ended up in roles most recently that were not necessarily things you planned for. You didn't necessarily think you were going to be Secretary of Education.
Not for a second.
But when you got the call, you decided, okay, I'll be nominated. What went into that decision?
It was a passion for passion for kids and a passion for their opportunity to become everything they can be. And it was another way to be able to help affect that kind of change. And yeah, that was the bottom line. And it was an opportunity to serve.
Yeah. And Dr. Birx, you were in Africa when you got this call to come serve as COVID
I was happy in
response
my service.
coordinator. But you did it. It wasn't really an ask, I suspect. Was it an ask or was it a request?
You know, it was an ask from a Marine. You know, and you know, they know what to say in that moment when you've been in the Army and they say, you know, we have a mission and we're failing and Americans are gonna die. And we were in conversations all through January and February. And I was backdooring information for him to take to the COVID task force. And I just kept saying to him, this is working. You don't have to identify me, I'll get you what you need. And he finally just called and said, you know, you have to come. And I could see the tsunami wave. I mean, I could see it coming. I just felt like we were just watching it and talking about containment. I don't know if you remember those early days when they decided to close to Europe and to China, but then we let everybody in by just saying, you know, fill out a symptoms card, and if you don't have symptoms, you're fine. But I knew that 85% of the people under 30 wouldn't have symptoms, and they were spreading the virus if they came infected. So I just felt like we were so far behind. I just, you know, he said it was a mission, and I had to accept it, and I did then.
And it was a tough job that you did for almost, you know, how long was that you were in that role?
7 years.
No, you weren't.
No.
You were in COVID.
Oh, 11 months.
11 months. It was
Oh, yeah,
long
11
months.
Yeah.
How did you, with?
It seemed longer.
How'd you manage through it personally?
You know, okay, so the reason I said no 5 times in January and February is even though I was working globally, you do read the news and see that things are a little chaotic in that White House. And I watched a lot of 3 and 4 stars not make it. And I was like, I'm not gonna make it. So I then had to decide that no matter what happened, I would stay and work, even if horrible things were said, even if, you know, people said bad things about me and my family. I just had to say, I'm gonna ignore all that, keep my head down and just work, because there's just too much that needs to be done.
Yeah.
And that's what I did to the end. But it was as bad as I thought it was gonna be. So, but I knew what I was getting into.
Yeah. Okay, so let's end on something a little more lighthearted. Secretary DeVos, you have 13 grandchildren, and I hear you love to read with them.
I do.
What do you read with your grandkids?
Well, it depends on their interests,
Yep.
so it varies. And their ages vary from 11 to 6 months. So I don't read anything to the 11-year-old anymore. She's out reading me every day. But no, I mean, there's any range of them. I mean, you know.
And is this true that you've started a summer camp for your grandchildren?
Yes, we have Fox Camp for the grandkids. DeVos happens to mean the fox. So it's Fox Camp, and we have held Fox Camp now for 2 years. This is becoming a tradition now, and it's a lot of fun.
What
Yeah,
fun
we
for
plan
them.
activities and wear them out.
Well, I want to be one of them.
Wear them out, so hopefully Grandma and Papa can sleep too.
And Dr. Birx, I love that you are both wearing scarves tonight. But Dr. Birx, you are particularly known for your scarves. There was an Instagram account created solely in honor of your scarves.
And I wore one tonight.
Thank you.
Talk about how the scarf collection came to be.
Yeah, so every now and again, President Trump will tweet about me, and he'll say she doesn't have many clothes. It's true. So I had learned to travel. One thing, when you travel to Africa, and I was in Africa at least 50% of the year, you can't check a bag. You'll never see your clothes again. So I learned that no matter how many weeks you're on the road, you have to have it in a carry-on. And I was watching the men all the time, because you know they would always roll in with their little carry-on, and I was like, open that up and show me what's in there. And so they would have like 3 white shirts and like 7 ties, and I was like, oh. So I started wearing, you know, taking like either navy blue or black and 30 scarves. And then it looked like I had something new on every day. So it was very exciting for everybody. They were like, oh, you have a new outfit. And I'm like, yes, I do. But then my really close friend who I think could see me in those press conferences, there's a place called Housing Works, and they do an auction of Hermes scarves. From women of means in the city, and she would buy them for me, and they would all go to young people, the proceeds, and she would send me a box. So I did have lots of scarves, but they were all secondhand, and I wore them proudly.
Well, everybody loved watching you in a new scarf when you were on TV every day. Well, please join me in thanking you,
Thank
two
you all
for
for
your
coming.
service to this
Thank
country
you.
and for being here tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Birx and Secretary DeVos, for being here. I also want to thank President Bush for staying because Aaron Judge did lead off the game and hit his 60-second home run tonight. So we'll have to watch, since you were all here, you get to watch that online. I want to thank Next Point for endowing the Engage at the Bush Center series. Next up is November 18th, our Merry and Bright Night Holiday Open House. You can go to bushcenter.org to register. And before we leave, I do want to take this moment to just pause and thank my colleague, Holly Kuzmich. This is her last official act, although she'll be here for another week as Executive Director of the Bush Institute. And she has been my valued partner since I've been here. She's been here almost a decade. Her hard work, her professionalism, and her kindness come through in all of our programming. I'm not sure people appreciate just how hard it is to grow a policy agenda both domestically and globally, grow our engagement in the policy world, take the Bush values and keep them alive in the halls of policymakers at local, state, and federal levels, grow our leadership programming, which now includes almost 1,000 alumni around the world, as well as our public engagement. And we could not have done what we've been able to accomplish without her efforts. And Holly, congratulations on an incredible tenure here. Please join me in thanking and recognizing Holly.